Okay, another episode of the podcast here. I wanted to geek out this time about old master studies, old master copies. Uh, Being an artist, I like talking about art, obviously. There's a long-standing tradition, and you start talking about like the classical tradition of art, and sometimes people get upset by the term classical because like many art terms, related terms especially, it has more than one meaning, and so there's a lot of different aspects that you can talk about when you talk about like something like a classical tradition or the classical art movement. But in this sense, when you're talking about it in terms of education, you're talking about something that was sort of really codified in the early 19th century. But it goes back to a long-standing tradition of sort of like if you had to sum it up into what its essence is it's looking to nature and studying to nature, as well as looking to the past and finding examples of artists who have done excellent work in the past of measuring nature, of their observations and how those observations translate to drawing and painting. And so you're looking to the past and you're looking to nature and you're seeing how it was done before you, and you're taking what was done before you and you're trying to improve upon it by expanding the tradition, expanding by carrying, in a sense, carrying the torch of art or really representation, and which involves a lot of careful study, right? And so from this careful study, and you can trace the mentality of this sort of tradition going all the way back, obviously, to the Renaissance, where, like from even an early age with artists, they would have them draw copies of the, older artists, examples of, say, features like eyes and nose and mouth. And so that was like the first contact of education. If you're aspiring to be an artist in the Renaissance and you're studying in a studio, which in a sense was sort of like a guild, or was a guild, but they're training people with whatever method at the time that they were using. But that method, and you say classical method, but it's a method that grows and evolves and changes, and some things get adopted and some things get left behind. But the core essence of it is this love for nature and this love for observation and recording, not only what you see, but what you see is sort of the basis, is sort of the start of it. And then after that, if you have a good teacher, they move you on to other things, but, imagination and everything. But, old master copies is sort of a way to set the bar for yourself in many ways. And it's also a good way to, just overall get better at some of the more technical aspects of drawing and painting. So if you're going to an atelier, what's going to happen is you're going to start off with the figure, doing a certain amount of time studying the figure, the live nude, and then usually about 3 hours, depending on the studio setup. Some people like to go all day for figure work for a shorter period of time, but then after that, they run that side by side with studying Bargue drawings, and you got Charles Bargue and Jean-Léon Gérôme in the 19th century sort of codified this, what was the official French stance on a proper art education. And so that was so it works you through this sort of rigorous method where you study the plates of the drawings, and they were doing studies of classical busts. They were doing classical sculpture, sort of in line with this reemergence of this neoclassical tradition that, like, more and more was being found out about the Romans, and the Romans also copied the Greeks. So it was sort of like carrying on in this tradition of, like, remembering the past and looking to the past and trying to learn from it. And of course, that sort of like turned the past into this idealized how it translates in the paint gets kind of funny. And that's something else entirely to talk about. But as far as the tradition goes, it's meant to teach people how to see. So personally, what I've gotten out of it has been not exactly the impression you get of what people think you can get out of them, which kind of sounds weird to say, but like I really think there's only so much that you can learn by doing old master studies, especially in light of just copying things in general, so often you'll get this sentiment, especially coming out of atelier, is that like, oh, if you can't paint like the old masters, like if you can't do a perfect master copy, how would you ever be able to begin to do an actual painting yourself, right? That's some of the sentiment that gets passed down to artists as a way to sort of like get them to see the necessity for doing old master copies. And while it is necessary, it doesn't in any way mean that you would be unable to do a composition on your own, right? Because the two don't exactly correlate. When you go into doing an old master copy, you really are only going to be able to learn a few things, and most of it's technical. The quality of line, the way that they, the proportion, how they saw, so the color and the value relationships. You're going to see how they did these things. If you're able to actually see the painting, sometimes you get insight into their technical approach and the order that they did something in. So you can get insight as far as that goes. But what you won't get good at is being able to do an actual picture. Like that is never going to come to you from doing an old master copy, and you can do them forever. And it's never going to give you the skills that it takes to actually make a picture and actually compose, because there's a lot of decision making happening, and what you're not doing in the old master copy is deciding everything, right? The scene and the picture and the light and the composition and the design and all the other things that go into just setting it up, and references and the process that happens from start to finish of doing studies and all this work. So you're coming in cold and just staring at someone else's work, and they did all the legwork for you, and you're just copying what their conclusion was. And so it's good to see, it's good to do, it's good to practice, but you won't become an expert. You won't become an expert at painting if that's all you do. Now you look at, like, you go back into history and you look at people like Rubens. Rubens continued over the course of his life to study not only the people of the past and the artists of the past who he respected, but also his contemporaries alongside of him. But what Rubens was known to do, and it's really fun to see looking at his sketches, he'd go to the museum and sketch a painting or a sculpture, but he would change it. He would always end up changing it. And in many ways, he improved it. So he would be looking at these works of art and looking at like what he liked about it, picking what he liked about it, and preserving that, but then also building upon that and changing it so that it better fit his design or his aesthetic, and his style too. So he was always reinterpreting privately for his own work. He was always reinterpreting in his studies old master work and contemporary work in his own words. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. I mean, this is sort of after he's been to school and learned and mastered his method. He continued doing it. He never stopped, which is something I strongly recommend that everyone do. I continuously, on a regular basis, I make a point to do a couple studies, whether they're like quick little sketches in paint or just drawing of like a portrait or a figure or something that strikes me of someone else's work. I'll just, it's fun to do studies because you can sort of see, it's sort of forcing you to see something from a slightly different perspective, like a figure that might have been not what you would have considered as far as the pose goes, or how they're handling the balance. So you can analyze their composition while you're doing that, and sort of, it's a good way to make notes. But when it really comes time to learn something, I think the most important aspect to think about when you're going to do an old master study is to have a goal, a real specific intent in mind when it comes to what you want to achieve by doing it. Some people just assume that, like, if you just copy, and this is not just with old master studies, it's with also just the model, or the or nature and landscape. Like, if you just copy, you're going to learn. And that's not the case, because you'll find people who have been just copying for years and years and years and years, and they haven't moved at all in the level that they're at. They've just been copying. So what you have to do is you have to have a goal in mind, and the goal has to be involved with tackling something that you're not certain of. So specifically find something that you don't know how to do in the picture that you're looking to copy, and then aim to understand that. And then and it doesn't, I mean, you can have more than one goal, right? Like, so I did a Lepage study in painting, my goals were multifaceted, and I took it one step at a time. And the first one was drawing. It was a portrait. So it's like, okay, I'm going to get the drawing as excellent and best as I could. So it was a drawing exercise first. Then it was a value exercise. It was like, okay, well, let's check out these values and what's flesh tone doing in overcast light. So I wanted to, and Lepage was really good at that. Like, overcast light, and what is the flesh doing as far as the color and the value. But with the color, there's a lot more of an intensity than I would have thought. So it became like a really fun sort of color lesson, and so it took on multiple facets. But in each one, the goal was to get better at these harmonies, to get better at drawing. I want to obtain the same quality of line, or I want to obtain the same quality of relationship between the foreground and the background. Learning to gauge space, for instance, in landscape. That can be an interesting and fun challenge for artists when they're first starting out. So it's really fun to see how somebody else does it, but you really learn a lot more than when you're pushing yourself towards a specific goal, or choosing something that addresses an aspect that you're weak at, right? And so, like, in alla prima, wet into wet techniques work really well. If you can find a painter that paints really well alla prima, then the goal can be like, okay, I'm gonna start to finish. It depends on if you know the working methods too, because researching working methods of the artist can be important depending on the kind of lesson that you're going to learn. And researching their methods is also a good exercise too, and just seeing how somebody else thinks about things. If there's records of the colors that they use in their palette, maybe it's fascinating stuff, as long as you don't let it completely suck you in and control all of your working methods. Because like with Rubens, you want to be able to copy, but at the same time to have your own spin, have your own take on it. But that becomes more important the further in you go. If you're first starting out with your education, you want to try to stick to it, because if you can't do it exactly like how you're seeing it, then your interpretation really isn't going to be any more interesting. If you can reach a point where you can mimic, you can handle the mimicry there, then you can expand. So there's a base level of skill set required before you can you can move on to sort of interpreting, I believe. So it's a fun thing to do. It's got a long and fascinating history to it, and but I think it's good to have a specific goal in mind, and not to just copy under the belief that that just by doing it you're gonna get better, and that it'll somehow make you able to compose and design a picture, because that's on a completely different level. So and being good at doing copies is not necessarily going to make you good at doing compositions and telling a story in paint. And Goya Goya is a fantastic example of that. Like, he wasn't the best painter. He really wasn't. He had his moments where he had his moments, but as far as like rendering goes, like, he wasn't all that good. But at the same time, his gesture and the value, his atmosphere, his sense of you know, the way that he told a story, the way that he composed, and the way that he designed his pieces, it really doesn't matter. And so it doesn't matter how well he was able to do a master copy. Fucking who cares? Who cares how well he did? Because the result was that, his strengths lied elsewhere. So that's also important to take note. Just because you might not necessarily be great at doing master copies doesn't at all mean that you will be bad at making pictures. So that's if you're not doing well in your bar classes, don't worry. They call it bar hell for a reason, and you get out as soon as you can. So you get it done and over with. But don't let it kill your love for the work that got you into it in the first place. And it's fun to, as you look at art over the years of learning, what ends up happening, and this is another reason why it's important not to kill yourself over a master copy, because what happens is, as you learn, you see more, and more is revealed to you. And there are things that are happening in paintings, Rembrandt paintings, for instance, or Bouguereau paintings, for instance, or whoever your painting heroes might be. There's more there than you can see, and as you learn to see, you see more, and it's sort of this weird thing, because like you can, it's not that you're seeing things and it's a complete mystery. You're starting seeing things to your level of understanding of how to do something, right? And then you'll catch something that's kind of mysterious, and in many ways, what it's doing is you're always, the goal is to always know more than what you can do, but then there's always more to be seen than what you can see currently based on your level. So going back to revisit sort of paintings over the years, if you practice art, is a good way to sort of find out. Sometimes you see something that you came to, right? Like in a picture, and in a way it can be like you discovered how to do something, right? You discovered a better way to render flesh, for instance, and then you look at the flesh tones or the way that another artist paints flesh, and you see a passage in the paint that looks really similar to something that you might have painted or thought about, and so it sort of reveals itself to you over time, and so that's an interesting and really fun aspect of the practice. But at the same time, what's happening is you're sort of developing taste, and as you become more educated, the things that you value in the beginning gradually change, and then also another exciting aspect of it, and sometimes it's disappointing, is when you go back and revisit some artists, they aren't as good as you remembered them to be when you were first starting out. And so, or sometimes you outgrow artists too. And so that sort of leads nicely into another aspect aside from old master studies, is sort of waiting to put yourself out there before you're ready. So people will be like, well, how do you know you're ready? You're never ready, and what I mean by put yourself out there is, what can happen is, like, an artist gets a certain amount of education, a certain amount of accomplishment in their ability to render and their ability to paint and draw, and then they start putting themselves out there and pushing their work and trying to get into competitions and galleries, and so you start playing that game. If you're not ready, meaning if you're under a certain skill set that might not be able to handle, for instance, the workload that could fall upon you should you get a gallery deal, for instance, or get into a gallery and have to do work for a show. If you bite off more than you can chew in a professional way, then you're only shooting yourself in the foot. And what can happen is people can sort of like fail upwards in a way that screws them over the further in they go, because if you're doing a work that looks like a certain way, and say that, and you're not that, you're just starting out, or not just starting out, but you're only a few years in, and you're producing work that looks a certain way because of your skill set, and say that takes off, or say people like it, or you start being able to sell that look. Well, now you're stuck. You can be stuck, and you can be stuck doing that kind of work regardless of whether or not you're growing and changing, and your taste is changing, and the things that you're interested in certain terms of subject matter are changing, because the things that you liked 5 years ago are a surprise, not the things that you like now, and so you've kind of moved on. But if you sort of like dig yourself into a hole like right off the bat, then not only are you limiting yourself and your ability to grow, because then you're stuck having to do the same kind of work, but then you risk losing your initial audience by growing, by changing. And so there is that risk. And in terms of workload and stress, you also can't worry about getting any better. So you think about it like, as soon as you're worrying about putting out work for either commercial or for galleries and for business, like if you're entering the business of making money with art, you're automatically limiting your ability to grow, just by way of having to dedicate more time to treating it like a business and pushing out art as to meet those deadlines. And so that's a reality that has to happen, and it's good that it happens, because that means you're doing something right. But at the same time, if it happens too soon, then you're just screwing yourself in the long run. You're making it more difficult for yourself in the immediate future to really develop into an artist that you could have been had you just waited and explored more and tried to figure out really what you want out of doing this, and where your tastes are. So that's and I've seen it sort of inadvertently, that sort of take out artists, not take out, but like, you can fail epically in that sort of way, with either, producing work for a show where nothing sells because it's just not the quality of work that that people are interested in for the price points that you're asking, or there's just so many other factors into it, because of all these other factors. And as far as business sort of takes you really far away from the craft, right? And so it's important to have a good way to ascertain your abilities. It's good to have a good grip on what you can do, and somewhat of an idea of where you want to go artistically. So if artistically you got the plan, and yourself, and it's not going to change, and you're dedicated to making this kind of art that looks this way for however long, then fine, go for it. But if you're looking to grow, forget competitions, forget galleries, forget turning it into a business until you reach a level where you can see very clearly where your skill is and how it compares next to your contemporaries that you admire. For instance, like, it's a good way to, see how you look up next to, skill set and all that, the whole nine yards. It's good to compare yourself as far as skills go to the people who you admire in art, because it's a good gauge. Because if they're getting, it doesn't mean you have to produce work that looks just like them, or even have work that's exactly on their level, but it's a good gauge to look at, like, okay, what's the skill set in this, at this level that I want to be at, and if it's, if you're honest with yourself, you'll know. You'll know that you're not there yet. And so when it's just an aspect of a side aspect, of developing taste and learning how to see and being able to properly sort of gauge your own abilities and judge where you want to go, and giving yourself enough time for that. And I know, like, with how fast-paced things are, taking a lot of time for that can be a real big pain in the ass. It can suck. It's like, who wants to spend such a long time, but it takes a long time. So it's good to keep that in mind, and I, it's an aspect of it looking back that, like, it's one of the things that, like, you talk about art. Like, I went to school for a long time, and my, your parents often give their kids shit. And so my mom, for instance, she would say things like, when you're going to put yourself out there. This is while I was still going to school. When you're going to put yourself out there, you're ready, and it's like, I love you, Mom, but, you don't know how high the bar is. And so, parents are nice and they're encouraging, but don't listen to them. If they're giving you advice that's not in your field, or not have anything to do with what you're studying. Because my mom's just looking at my abilities. She's not looking at what I want to accomplish, So it'd be different when, like, if I were to sit her down and open the Reppin book and point at one of his paintings and be like, this is what does what I do look like this, and of course, she's your mom, so she's like, yes, of course. No, so you can look and see, the more you learn about where you need to go, and of course, you don't have to be master level to be successful as an artist, and most of them are not, and you grow into it, but you want to reach a certain level first, and before, and setting the bar high, just not crushingly high, but high enough to keep you excited, and just urging yourself and into things that are unknown with your art practice. I always try to do that in mine. Every painting I do, I'm always sure to try something out that I'm not sure about, where I can't guess what the outcome is going to be, so I can learn something, Sometimes that's the entire painting, and then, it takes a lot longer to do. Every one of my big paintings has been one of that. It's always been a complete leap into the unknown, where, like, I didn't know how to do almost just about everything that I was trying to do. Scale and complexity, and so the big paintings I tend to bite off more than I can chew, and I pay the price as far as time goes, and the longer I spend on a painting, the more risk there is of my style, not my style, but, like, my look changing just enough to where I have to go back. That happened with my Faust painting. I got to the end of the painting, and some of the things that I had painted did not at all look like stuff that I had painted at the start, so had to go back and repaint a few things. Again, it's easier to do once you've already done it. You can, but it's just a lot of work. So the longer pieces take a lot out, but it's good to have on smaller pieces, being like, always pushing your boundaries, whether it's how fast you're doing something, pushing yourself to become faster and more is really pushing yourself to become more efficient. And so that's really good to learn. And then pushing yourself to be more accurate. I never go for any length of time without at some point zooming back into accuracy. It's fun to be loose, and it's fun to play, and it's fun to set yourself up to where you can do that. And it's really important to, actually, because a lot of fun things, a lot of good things, and educational things can happen in your practice when you do that. So, but I never let it go for too long. I always end up going back, because it's it's something you have to constantly exercise. Accuracy and drawing a proportion. Proportion is one of those things that you will forever be struggling with. So yeah, that's sort of my quick spiel for this week's podcast. It's shorter this time because I have a lot of other things going on right now. I'm starting to teach this week. It's a full. My days are going to be very full. I teach 3 classes, and then with working all the other jobs, it's time consuming. So I do have some other fun subjects as far as podcast goes that are coming up. So, but some of those require research and reading, and which I'm currently also doing. So, I'm not going to rush it. These things happen when they happen. But that I figured on the down weeks when I'm not working on something else, I like geeking out about art, because it's originally why I wanted to start this whole thing to begin with, the podcast. So anyway, I got a show coming up at the end of the month, Damned. It's a really, really fun show. It'll be a Halloween show. I'll have more information about it later. It's at the Tangent Gallery in Detroit. So I hope I sell something. No, it looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. So, yeah, I'll talk more about that the closer we get to the date at the end of the month here. So, a lot to do, but thank you for tuning in. I got the Omni Lucid Media page on Facebook that you can check out. I got there's Matt Miller over at Beard Plays. You can check his place out, his podcast, his place. He plays video games at his place. And Ryan Nieder's at Black Ark Paladin. He's doing the podcasting too over there. So check all those guys out. Thanks for listening, and I will be yelling at you later.